Well, we are getting a readout, Keir Simmons, and I know you don't have it. And I haven't been able to read the entire thing because it was just handed to me. But this is from the. You've got it now?
Yep.
Okay,
yeah.
So it's from the news agency.
We have the Russian readout, Chris, if that's...
Yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And you can tell me, but the part that I got to that raised a red flag was this. It was emphasized that the key condition for preventing the escalation of the conflict and working toward its resolution by political and diplomatic means should be the complete cessation of foreign military aid and the provision of intelligence information to Kyiv. But maybe you've had a chance to read the entire thing, which I'm only about halfway through.
Yeah, I'm still picking through it myself, Chris. It's been translated from Russian. One thing I will tell you, just for viewers to know, and you know, the viewers will understand that we're still making sense of this, is that the Kremlin readout and the White House readout is different. So they haven't kind of agreed a joint statement. They've put out their different interpretations of what's been said. I will say that as far as we can tell from the Kremlin readout, it does not include a mention of the Black Sea. So one of the points I would make here is that I think that this is still negotiations in progress. So a week ago, the Ukrainians appeared to agree to, well, they agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, you know, punctuation point, nothing more. Here you have a negotiation between the US and the Russians about all kinds of things, not simply a ceasefire. Now, what the Kremlin does say, and I'll just read this piece because, as Garrett suggested, this is important. During the conversation, Donald Trump put forward a proposal for the parties to the conflict to mutually refrain from striking energy infrastructure facilities for 30 days. Vladimir Putin responded positively to this initiative and immediately gave the Russian military the corresponding order. So it appears right now the Russians have agreed to and are implementing a 30-day ceasefire in respect of energy infrastructure facilities. Simply that. Now there is a lot more to this Russian readout, including a lot about prisoner exchanges and the Russians handing over Ukrainian prisoners, for example. And it is kind of described, or it is portrayed in this Russian readout as the Russians, you know, offering compromise in a sense. But there isn't really much compromise in this beyond that. And as you mentioned, this question of whether the US is agreeing to restrict support for Ukraine during this ceasefire, that will be deeply controversial because, okay, after the ceasefire, what happens? What kind of negotiation is there during the ceasefire over what kind of support Ukraine might get? And, of course, one of President Putin's long-standing aims has been to ensure that Ukraine is neutral, and Ukrainians would say to neutralize the country. So that would appear to be a concession to the Russians. There's another point in here which I didn't hear. I haven't seen the Washington readout, but I didn't hear, Chris, in what you were sharing with viewers. The Russian readout talks a lot about normalization, which translates as you know, removing sanctions, rebuilding economic ties, the kind of things that the Russians really want. One last point, Chris, in this Russian readout, which you know, kind of gets your attention, although it may seem fairly small compared with the others. It says Donald Trump supported Vladimir Putin's idea to organize hockey matches in the US and Russia between Russian and American players playing in the NHL and the KHL.
All right, so let me go back to you, if I can, Garrett. The look on your face may say everything about hockey, but on the bigger picture, clearly these are two very different statements and no decisions. That there's no clarity on any agreement here.
Well, look, I think there are a couple of points. On the idea of the 30-day ceasefire against energy infrastructure, that does seem to be the big key deliverable point that is, at least in principle, agreed on in both statements. The Kremlin statement goes farther than does the White House statement. The Kremlin statement does also mention President Putin, it says, responding favorably to President Trump talking about this peace or security initiative related to the Black Sea. So there's at least an acknowledgement that that was a topic that came up. I was smiling at Keir's mention of the point about about hockey because I was just reading to that myself, and I actually don't think it's a small thing at all because to me, it tells me that the Russians have a pretty good read on the way that Donald Trump likes to engage in diplomacy. He cares about the personal relationships with the people that he conducts diplomacy with, other foreign leaders, perhaps more than other American presidents do. He likes to have those touch points with those people. He likes to have those relationships, and he likes to talk about sports. And the idea that President Putin would bring up hockey, which we know that the president has recently been interested in when there was that Four Nations Cup going on here in the U.S. with the U.S., Canada, other nations, as a way to generate some kind of goodwill between two foreign leaders of countries that have had no goodwill between them for some number of years, I think is sort of a notable thing to do in the first place, and to include by the Russians that they are sort of operating in this way, trying to talk about something in this kind of friendly and personal manner with Donald Trump. It tells me they understand the way he likes to engage in diplomacy, and I don't think that's a small thing at all.
I don't think so, Mark. Garrett makes a really good point, and he's old enough, Donald Trump, to have lived through the Cold War, to remember the Miracle on Ice, to remember when Jimmy Carter decided to pull from the U.S., to change the Olympics, to pull the U.S. from the Olympics. I mean, he also knows what entertainment is, right? And whether or not you consider, whatever you consider the relationship to be between the United States and Russia at this point, a hockey game is something that would attract a lot of attention and that Donald Trump would enjoy. But big picture, how do you see this?
Well, let me say the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey win over the Soviet Union was probably one of the great moments of my life. I played high school hockey, so this was a fantastic experience for me. And don't forget, and I can't believe we're talking about this, but Alex Ovechkin, who is a Russian who plays for the Washington Capitals, who was a friend of Putin, is 8 goals away from breaking the all-time NHL record. So perhaps the Russians did have something in raising this. But on a serious note,
and you just
picture,
knew that off the top of your head, so I'm impressed with your hockey knowledge. Yeah, okay.
But big picture, look, there are clearly different readouts of this. I think the Russians are doing what they do, which is throw in kind of details and roadblocks. There's going to be negotiation after negotiation. A lot of people are going to pick through certain things that presumably would be favorable, but then a lot which would be unfavorable. But overall, I think that everyone who has spoken now is correct in the sense of these are negotiations that are going on right now. I would not get too optimistic. The Russians are very tough negotiators. I think there's a long way to go. On one note to mention is, Europe was really holding their breath at this phone call, and perhaps it's not as bad as many would have thought, which would have been, in their view, that the U.S. would kind of sell Ukraine down the river. So I would say this is just another step in the negotiations. The Russians are going to play hardball, and maybe we'll get a good hockey game out of it.
Well, where does this leave Ukraine, though, Mark?
So from the Ukrainian side, I think what they see is, of course, two major powers, the U.S. and Russia, talking about the future of their country. And that's deeply disturbing to the Ukrainians, but also to the rest of Europe. I would hope there will be some readouts given to Ukraine from the U.S. side. And the real key point on this in terms of concessions or the future is the provision of both intelligence and military assistance. That cannot be something that the Russians might agree to it. The U.S. in no way can agree to that, and Ukrainians certainly would not as well. You don't do that before any kind of ceasefire negotiations. That's a non-starter.
Can I go back for just a second, Garrett, to the end of the first page of this translation, which is March 19th, which happens to be tomorrow. A prisoner exchange would be carried out. You mentioned this between the Russian and Ukrainian sides, 175 for 175 people. And as a gesture of goodwill, 23 seriously wounded Ukrainian servicemen who are undergoing treatment in a Russian medical institutions will be transferred. Donald Trump is also someone who likes to say, I got a deliverable. I told you that I was going to work on this, and here's what I have for you.
Yeah, that's true, Chris. And frankly, it's kind of White House diplomacy 101 that you would not involve the president of the United States in negotiations unless there is a deliverable to be had. This White House does so many things in non-traditional ways, but this is something that you would actually expect to see almost in any other White House, where the negotiations happen at a lower level first, and then when there's a victory to be claimed, you bring in the president to claim it. Notably, the White House statement does not mention that prisoner exchange, although I was reminded that this was something that came up when President Zelensky was in the Oval Office for that incredibly ill-fated meeting he had here just a few weeks ago. Zelensky talked about the fact that when he was being pressed by J.D. Vance about past diplomatic efforts, that Russia had failed to honor past agreements to do prisoner swaps just like this. So I think it's both an important deliverable and another important touch point in kind of building trust here and goodwill between at least the U.S. and Russia, and perhaps the Ukrainians and Russia as well, that started with the release of Mark Fogel a couple of years ago around the first Trump-Putin phone call, and now could potentially include this prisoner swap if and when that does occur, as is suggested to be happening tomorrow in the Russian readout, but again, not in the White House readout.